The story of the Polygon Collosus N7 is one of numbers, most of which are very big. It's got 170 millimeters of travel, 16 suspension bearings, and it weighs over 41 pounds. But one number is impressively small, and that's the price tag, because this bike costs just $1,999 US. Now, I'm far from a mathematician, but I've taken the last couple weeks to try and get a good grasp on what all those numbers mean on the trail, and more importantly, if they sum up to something that looks like your next bike. You can't talk about the Collosus without first talking about its suspension, which also might be one of the hardest parts of the N7's math equation for me to understand. The bike features Polygon's 6-bar suspension design that they call independent floating suspension, or IFS. In this setup, a 4-bar linkage, including the chainstay, 2 small counter-rotating links, and the front triangle, determine the axle path, anti-squat, and anti-rise. This leaves the seat stay to drive the shock and dictate the leverage or progression rate of the 170 millimeters of travel. All of this should, in theory, maximize both pedaling and descending performance, and for the most part, it does. But there's still one more number we need to talk about, and it's a big one. The size large N7 that I've been testing, set up tubeless and with pedals installed, tipped the scale at 41.2 pounds or 18.7 kilograms. To be honest, this makes me wonder if the sophisticated suspension kinematics delivered by the IFS system are worth the increased weight, not to mention long-term maintenance. I'd also imagine that sticking with a single pivot linkage-driven design like Polygon already uses on their trail bikes, as well as their previous generation enduro bike, would help save money that could have potentially gone back into speccing higher quality components on this very value-oriented bike. Now, that's not to say that the IFS is a poor design. Quite the opposite, in fact. It's a very high-performing setup that I would love to see employed on a carbon fiber frame and maybe some higher-end, i.e. lighter components. But it does seem like an interesting choice for a line of bikes designed to push the envelope on affordability. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts on it. Do you think the 41-pound weight is justified by this 6-bar setup, or does it end up being a zero-sum game? Let me know in the comments. Another thing worth noting about the IFS design is that all of the linkages and pivots are above or in front of the bottom bracket, and this has allowed Polygon to fit some super short 435mm chainstays on the Collosus. And while short chainstays are a bit out of vogue these days, I'm still a big fan of them in general, as well as on this bike specifically. Together with the relatively high bottom bracket, they managed to keep the portly N7 feeling surprisingly sprightly and maneuverable through tight, techy sections of trail and on jump lines. The rest of the numbers on the Collosus are quite on trend with comparable 170mm enduro bikes. It features a 63.5-degree head tube angle and 77-degree seat tube angle, as well as a 634mm stack height, 480mm reach, and a 1266mm wheelbase on the size large I tested. Collectively, these numbers sum to a bike that sits a bit more on the playful and nimble side of the long travel spectrum. This does a surprisingly good job at hiding the N7's weight while descending both tech lines and jump trails. The N7's aluminum frame has all the features you'd expect from a modern enduro bike. It's got ISCG tabs, plenty of frame protection, and at least on my size large, fits a full-size water bottle. It's also got pretty dang impressive tire clearance. The bike comes stock with 29 by 2.6 inch tires, which fit with a fair bit of room in every direction, and I can't imagine, nor would I suggest, anyone running bigger rubber than that. One slight gripe I have is the relatively minimal dropper post insertion. My size large came with a 170mm post that couldn't be fully inserted, which essentially negates the benefit of the nice and short 415mm seat tube. Lastly, for those of you who are as vain as I am, I personally think the frame looks great. The straight top tube, shock, and seat stay all run parallel to each other for a clean, aggressive look. The candy red paint paired with chrome logos didn't hurt either, especially once I stole my wife's polished P&W pedals. So that's most of the numbers out of the way, but there's still one more seriously significant figure that we have not talked about, and that's the price tag. To my knowledge, this N7 that costs $1,999 is the cheapest MSRP enduro bike on the market. And if you think they got here by bolting on a collection of undergunned, poor-performing components, you'd be wrong. Mostly. The N7 comes with a 170mm RockShox Zeb base fork and Super Deluxe Select Plus shock. Despite sitting at the bottom end of the Zeb range, I had zero complaints with the fork and found its narrow range of settings sufficient to get the bike feeling good on a variety of terrain. My preferred settings ended up being 90 psi, about 10 higher than recommended for my weight, 1 volume token, and my rebound at 9 clicks from the open or fast position. I left the compression fully open on slower, techier trails and added 1 click on faster terrain with bigger hits. For context, I weigh about 210 pounds in full riding gear and like my fork to sit a bit higher in its travel. So while I found the Zeb base fork very easy to get along with, it was a bit of a different story when it came to the Super Deluxe Select Plus shock. The shock doesn't feature any compression adjustment, and even while running pressures as high as 230 psi with 5 clicks of rebound damping, I was still easily going through all the travel on bigger hits. Thankfully though, the shock features RockShox's hydraulic bottom-out technology, or HBO, meaning I couldn't feel when I ran out of travel, but nevertheless, I was. Now, I'm guessing that could have been cured by installing a volume-reducing spacer or two, but I never got a chance to try that while testing the bike. One thing I did like about this shock and the way it performed on the N7 is that it had a pretty supportive mid-stroke. This, along with the short chainstays and high bottom bracket, made it pretty easy to get that front end up for things like bunny hops and manuals. Moving on then to the drivetrain. The N7 comes spec with a Shimano Dior derailleur and shift lever paired with a Sunrace cassette and KMC chain. The shifting was smooth, but still noticeably louder and more hesitant than a full Dior setup. That said, it's still pretty impressive they fitted a bike at this price point with a 12-speed drivetrain at all. Braking on the N7 is provided by Tektro, with an HD M735 4-piston caliper in the front and a dual piston in the rear, mated to 203mm rotors on both ends of the bike. I'm a large rider, and in my opinion, far from a brake snob, but at least for me, these brakes were not nearly powerful enough to handle this behemoth of a bike. They'd slow you down, but not in a hurry, and if I were planning to race this bike or spend a season in the bike park, they'd be the first thing I'd look to upgrade. There's a chance that swapping the resin pads for metallic ones may be enough, but I'm guessing you need to go for a bit higher end setup, like the TRP Slate Evos, to fully remedy the problem. Lastly, the N7 comes with a pair of 29 by 2.6 inch V Tireco Flow Snap tires. These provided pretty exceptional grip, even in the rainy fall conditions I regularly found myself in while testing. That said, they're far from light, with a claimed weight of 1,400 grams per tire and mounted to some equally heavy OEM aluminum wheels. Collectively, both tires and wheels came in at 12 pounds or 5.4 kilograms. And I'll circle back to what I was saying earlier about the suspension setup on this bike. It's hard to worry too much about having the exact amount of anti-squat when you're working to move a wheel like this up a hill. That said, I doubt anyone's going to be buying the N7 for its climbing performance, and I'm happy to report that both the tires and the wheels were very durable. I never got a single flat tire or rim damage while testing. Speaking of testing, it's time to talk about how the N7 performs on the trail, starting with the climbs. As much as I've talked down on this bike's weight and how it could negatively impact climbing performance, pedaling the bike up fire roads and even single track sucked less than I expected. The IFS suspension worked as promised, and there was very little pedal bob, even with the shock left open. The bike also had an impressive amount of traction over wet rocks and roots and felt surprisingly maneuverable on techier climbs. I'm personally not a fan of climbing fire roads, but I'm guessing that many prospective N7 buyers will be using them to access their favorite enduro tracks. Neither the fork or shock can be fully locked out, but even still, the bike did a good job of transferring all of your power through the wheels and onto the ground. As I mentioned earlier, the drivetrain was a bit noisy, but I'm guessing that was due to the inclemental weather I was riding in and would likely be mitigated by replacing the KMC chain with a Shimano one. All in all, the Collosus N7 punches above its price and I guess you could say below its weight on the climbs. It's far from a climber's enduro bike, but still felt pretty manageable on the uphills. Now on to the good stuff, but before I talk about how the N7 descends, if you're liking this video, just a quick reminder to go ahead and hit that like button, as well as subscribe to the 99 Spokes YouTube channel. We've got a lot more reviews coming up this fall and winter, and that way you won't miss any of them. Now, back to the bike. My first ride on the Collosus was shuttling a trail I'd never ridden before. On my first run down, I was pretty convinced that the N7 was the antithesis of everything I love about mountain biking. It felt muted, cumbersome, and worst of all, loud. For context, I was riding on a moderately technical blue trail, and the bike that I had just wrapped up testing was the all-new 29-inch Marin San Quentin. That's a hardtail with 140mm of travel. And while the chain slap and cable rattle didn't change as the day went on, my understanding and appreciation of the bike definitely did. The N7 actually has some pretty sporty geometry, but its weight means that it has to be ridden really aggressively to bring that out. I kept this in mind on subsequent rides, and as long as I was willing to push the bike hard, it was exceptionally more fun and capable than its $2,000 price tag would suggest. Unsurprisingly, it handled high-speed rock gardens and head height drops with ease. I mentioned earlier that I found the stock shock configuration to bottom out relatively easily, but the RockShox HBO eliminated any harsh sensations. What did surprise me though was how fun the bike was to ride on flow trails, as long as they were steep. The short chainstays and high bottom bracket made popping off lips and throwing whips easy. But as soon as the trail started to peter out, the heavy, slow-rolling tires paired with the 170mm of travel zapped any attempt to pump to maintain speed. Lastly, as I mentioned earlier, the Tektro brakes were not up to par with the rest of the bike. Most of my riding was done at a relatively comfortable pace in familiar territory, but I would have been nervous trying to push this bike in a different setting. Thankfully though, brakes are a relatively inexpensive upgrade, and it's one that I would recommend most riders doing pretty early on if they go ahead and purchase an N7. I've always hated the notion that a bike's price point should correlate with the skill level of the rider buying it, as if new novice riders were the only ones buying inexpensive bikes, and higher-end bikes were only purchased by more advanced riders. And I think it's safe to say that the Polygon Collosus N7 is also at odds with this stereotype. The bike's portly size requires some relatively aggressive riding to make the most out of the sporty geometry and highly sophisticated suspension platform. I think a new rider would be lucky to do anything more than hang on while descending the N7, and it's definitely not going to be a better scenario if on the off chance they had to pedal back up as well. So if not beginners, who is the N7 for? Well, for me, it's easy. It's park rats. It's got a super durable aluminum frame with lively, dare I say playful geometry, and a part spec that's not going to keep you up at night if you break a derailleur or scratch a stanchion. The weight shouldn't be an issue here either, as long as you don't mind bringing some beer for the poor lifties who have to load your 40-pound bike onto the chair all day long. And for those of you who care, the forks crown does clear the down tube. So you could, in theory, remove the dropper, route the front brake through the headset, and go full slope duro with the N7. I think the Colossus could make a pretty good enduro race frame as well, though on this bike with the heavier, less sophisticated components, I can't imagine that being a very enjoyable, let alone competitive experience. Polygon does, however, sell this bike with a slightly higher build. It's the N9, and that would probably be a better option for those looking to race the bike. Lastly, as we always do, I want to compare this with a few comparable bikes on the market. Like I mentioned earlier, the N7's MSRP is well below any other competitor on the market, but there are a couple bikes that come close. The first is the YT Capra Core 1, which lists for $2,699, and the second is the Canyon Torque AL1, which costs $2,999 US. All three of these bikes feature aluminum frames, 170mm of travel, and 29-inch wheels. They also are all coming from direct-to-consumer companies, which is in large part what allows their price to be so low. In terms of geometry, the N7 sits in the middle of these two bikes, with the Capra having a bit sportier feel with a slightly steeper head tube angle, shorter reach, and shorter chainstays. The Torque, on the other hand, has the same 63.5-degree head tube angle as the Colossus, but stretches the rest of the bike out. I'll list the spec of each bike on the screen, but I think it's safe to say that the Torque has the best components of the three and is therefore, unsurprisingly, the lightest, weighing a respectable 36.2 pounds or 16.4 kilograms. The Capra is just a hair heavier at 36.6 pounds or 16.6 kilograms. And that makes the N7 quite an outlier in weight, weighing about 5 pounds more than those other two. And while some of that is definitely coming from that IFS suspension, much of it is in these wheels and tires. And if you wanted this frame, you wanted this bike, but a little lower weight, replacing those would definitely help cut that down. To be honest though, if I had the choice of buying one of those lighter bikes or buying this N7 and taking my extra money and putting it towards a season pass or maybe even a trip to Whistler, I would be choosing the latter. And I really think that speaks to the person who the N7 is going to be best for. Regardless of how you tally the numbers though, the N7 is a serious contender in the value-priced enduro market. And now that you've learned a little bit more about this bike, I want to hear from you. What do you think about it? You got any more questions? Do you have any thoughts about it? Things you would change, things you love? Let me know what those are down in the comments. And of course, while you're there, don't forget to subscribe to the 99 Spokes YouTube channel. Lastly, remember that bikes are for everyone. Have fun out there.